everyone, this is my run on Ambition for Provenance Lufenia stage, which is Kamlanot's Lost Chapter event. And as always, I'll be including a timestamp in the video description so you can use that to jump ahead to the section that you are interested in. I'll be covering a brief overview of the fight as well as the party setup before going into the actual battle. So coming to this fight, it's only one wave consisting of the Protean boss, and from what I can tell it's actually less tanky than the previous Lufenia stage with Tyrant. However, there are few things that you need to consider, and I think first and foremost the trickiest part of this challenge is the Lufenia orb itself. So the orb appears on each Protean monster whenever their HP falls below 80%, and the orb will stay until it either triggers at 0 count or the boss dies. And there's no way to pause the orb other than entering summon or burst mode. But you can increase the orb count by disabling the boss. And I'll just go into a bit more detail on how you can actually disable the bosses. So disable in this sense means that the boss actually needs to get a turn, and on their turn they need to be prevented from doing any action. So because of this, turn deletion will not work, and turn delay will also not work. If you actually delete or delay the boss's turns, each time any of your other party members takes a turn, the orb will continue to tick down by 1. And eventually the orb will tick down to 0, and it will still trigger automatically, killing your entire party. So how do you actually prevent the boss from taking an action? Well, there's a few different options. The most common one would be to inflict the paralysis status, and Kamlanot would be the best choice for the option, given that it's also his featured event here. There are other units that can inflict paralysis. Shantoto's LD is also another good choice, especially since Shantoto herself is a synergy unit here. Other than that, you have the old favorites such as Cloud, or you can use Raijin with the added bonus that the boss is also weak to lightning. However, Raijin's paralysis can only be done once every 3 turns due to his stacking mechanic. Then you also have other units such as Dash, who can possibly inflict paralysis, but Dash's paralysis is very RNG based, so I wouldn't recommend him as the sole disabler in your team. Beyond paralysis, any other status debuff that prevents the boss from taking an action will also work. So other examples would be Sleep from Edward's LD, Confuse from Porum's Cry, but Confuse itself is also RNG dependent because it's not a guaranteed infliction. You can inflict Terror from Elnudge. Terror itself is a very good choice because the boss will eventually be targeting the entire party, so at that point in time you can actually just Terror lock them down with Elnudge. However, using Elnudge comes with a drawback in the sense that the boss is heavily resistant to magic, so if you want to bring in Elnudge, by default you also will need to bring in some form of Enchanter and Impaler to get around the boss's resistance to range attacks. But beyond that, Elnudge is actually a very good choice. Other options will include inflicting HP attack disable with either Kefka or Arciala. However, do note that for HP attack disable to kick in, the boss will actually need to be doing some form of HP attack during that turn. And so the risk of relying on HP attack disable is that if the boss end up using brave attacks on its turn, it still counts as taking an action and you will not be able to increase the orb counter. So HP attack disable by itself is a somewhat risky status to rely on for this fight, unless you can somehow time it in relation to their HP attacks. You really do not want the orb to count down to 0 because the orb triggering is more or less the end of the run. It will dispel all buffs and debuffs and will unleash a powerful group party attack. The boss also has different stances, so it has a guard stance and an attack stance, and it will actually tell you when it uses each stance, and eventually it will use attack and guard stance as well. From experience though, I haven't really seen what they can do while in each stance because I actually managed to keep them disabled throughout most of the fight until they are dead. So this also means that if you set up your party just right, you should be able to disable the bosses for most of the fight and not need to bring in any tank or healer because you won't actually be taking any HP attacks at all. So coming to this party setup, first and foremost, I decided to use Edward, mainly for his sleep debuff, and that is the turn disabler that I rely on. I did some early testing with Edward along with another disabler, so another unit that can inflict paralysis or HP attack disable, for example Shantoto or Kefka. But from testing, I find that you don't actually need more than Edward. As long as you pair Edward with very strong DPS characters, having the 3 sleep debuffs used in a timely manner is actually enough to increase the orb 3 times until the boss is dead. So to complement Edward, the other 2 party members need to be high DPS characters. So my first choice here would be Lightning. Now Lightning is a little bit risky here, mainly because she has a lot of turn delay built into her kit. So if you're using Lightning, on the one hand she brings excellent DPS onto this fight, but on the other hand you need to be very careful with when you actually use Lightning's delay, in particular her EX and her LD, because using each of them will typically mean that the orb will get the chance to tick down by 3 or 4 more turns. So you need to plan ahead before using her LD and EX and see where you can actually slot Edward's sleep in. On the flip side though, the positive thing about pairing Lightning with Edward is that you can actually alternate between Edward's sleep and Lightning's delay. So for example, right before the boss is about to get their turn, if their orb counter is still relatively high, you can first use Lightning's LD or EX to delay, and by the time the bosses is about to get their next turn and their orb counter becomes pretty low, that's when you nail them with Edward's sleep, and that will refresh the orb count to close to 20 again, and the boss will not be able to act because they are asleep, and then you can repeat another cycle of Lightning's delay shenanigans all over again. So essentially delay sleep, delay sleep, delay sleep cycle all the way until the boss is dead. Finally, third party member that I used is Kuja, and I brought Kuja in mainly as another strong DPS option, but really I find that the third slot is pretty flexible. If you want an extra safety net, you can fill in the third slot with another disabled character. Shantoto is an excellent choice because she can inflict 100% paralysis through her LD, and she also herself is a very strong DPS option for this fight. Or you can include units such as Kefka for the HP attack disable. Another good option will also be will also be Kurasame, because Kurasame can inflict the HP attack damage up. But you again do need to be a bit careful. So long as you can keep the bosses disabled and cycle between Lightning's Delay and Edward's Sleep, you should be fine for most of the fight. And the strategy that I use is to pop my summon near the end after Edward has used his third and final sleep debuff to allow additional turns of damage in while keeping the orb paused. You can also use your burst mode to get additional turns of damage in, especially if you have lightning burst or your third party member with a burst mode. However, I did have Kuja with burst, but I ended up actually not needing to use his burst at all. So there is really, it shows that there's a lot of leeway here in this fight. The friend support that I used with this party setup was Kurasame, mainly because I can then bring in the Kurasame and inflict his LD right before I pop my summon for the additional 30% HP damage boost during summon. Summon of choice here, I used Shiva, mainly for her speed up, and also the boss is weak against ice, so it will enable everyone to hit for weakness damage during summon mode. It's really not needed because Kuja can also inflict Holy, Enchant and Imperil. So there are many other options for summon that you can consider, but I really just felt comfortable using Shiva here. So that's it. Let's move into the fight. I'll see you there. Okay, so starting off in the fight, at the start of the fight, from 100% to 80% health, the orb isn't present. So this is where you want to do just slow and steady damage and save all your turn disablers for when the Lufenia orb actually appears. Given that I bring in Kuja, which excels in AoE attacks, and that I'm relying just on Edward's Sleep for turn disable, I try to damage the bosses as evenly as possible, with the goal of activating the orbs at roughly the same time. So this allows me to easily control the orb counters through one application of sleep, rather than having the orbs at different counts and making it difficult to increase the counter, because Edward only has 3 uses of his LD Lullaby. I try to delay the boss as much as possible, and that's to really capitalize the fact that the first few attacks the bosses do are only brave attacks, regardless of what HP they are in. And so during the start of the fight, I tried to reach Lightning's EX Army of 1 plus twice, so that I can use it once each on each of the Protean bosses, and that way I get to continue on my steady stream of damage with Kuja and Edward while the bosses remain delayed. The boss's first turn is always a single target attack, and another trick that you can consider doing is to just resetting the wave until both bosses are targeting Edward, and you can then just use Hide on Edward to completely nullify the boss's first turn attack. However, really it's not necessary at all, and you can get by very easily regardless of who the bosses are targeting. Okay, so from this attack I trigger the orb appearing, and this is just as the bosses are about to get their first turn. Another option is to try to delay this a little bit further by using Lightning's LD again, but really it's not necessary. So I've now hit the 79% HP threshold. The orb has appeared at a count of 15. The bosses each have taken 1 turn. And on the second turn, they will start using brave AoE attacks. But as long as you keep them broken, it's fine. And Edward also can battery the entire party so that not everyone gets broken by that attack. If you need to, you can also just send Edward into hike stance to ensure that at least he doesn't get broken. And with this sort of party comp, you can easily re-break the bosses afterwards again anyway. From here on in, as you deal damage with lightning, you need to keep an eye on the orb counter on the bosses, especially when it starts dropping below 10 and lightning EX or LD is about to be used. You want to carefully count how far they will get pushed back. You also need to consider that lightning and Kuja will get their turn pushed up when they use high turn rate abilities. Kuja with his Ultima Plus and lightning with pretty much all her attacks. And those free turns or turn rate increase will lead to the orb counting down as well. So you just want to allow yourself some additional buffer. So here I used Edward's first lullaby, roughly when the orb is at about 7 or 8 count. So Protean boss B has taken its turn, was asleep, and so increased the turn counter again. And when you first inflict Edward's sleep, you do want to pay attention to how many turns of sleep is left on the bosses, and knowing that each attack targeting the boss will decrease the sleep counter by 1, you want to try to maximize sleep by trying to see whether you can let the boss sleep for 2 actions. So here you can see Protean B, second turn after getting inflicted by sleep, he goes to sleep again, and the sleep very nicely lasts just long enough for 2 boss actions. So this is quite useful for 2 reasons. Firstly, it guarantees that after 2 turns of asleep, the orb counter will increase all the way to 20, regardless of what it was prior to using his LD. Second reason is that by disabling the bosses for 2 turns, you get that extra few turns of damage in, which is quite helpful, and you get to use up Lightning's remaining LD buff right before sleep ends. And after this, as the part where I'm here on now, because the sleep counter is relatively high, you can eventually use Lightning's LD again to delay the bosses and go into another cycle of attack. So here I decided not to use Lightning's LD, mainly because the orb counter is at 7 to 8. So I wanted to kneel them with another sleep again to refresh the orb counter. So similar to what I did previously when the orb ticked down to 7 to 8 turns roughly, I kneeled them with Edward sleep again. And at this point, although Lightning's LD buff is gone, I couldn't use another one because I really wanted the bosses to get turns again. So I just used regular attacks with Lightning while waiting for the boss to start getting turns. Protean B at this stage has gotten a turn, so the orb counter has increased back to 20. So I focus targeting Protean B while waiting for Protean A to get its turn. Okay, so now that the orb has refreshed again, so this is when I use Lightning's LD. It's to buy me additional turns of damage without letting the boss get a turn. So I can pile on the damage while the orb slowly ticks down, boss gets delayed, doesn't get to act. And I keep doing this until the orb counter reaches about 7 to 8 again, so that I can nail them with Edward Sleep right after that. Okay, so Protean Beast orb counters at 4, so this is where I decided to use Edward's third and final lullaby to reset the orb counter all over again. So similar to before, I try to let sleep last for 2 boss actions. So since their turn is about to come up, I hold off on delaying them with lightning and just use regular attacks. Keeping a very close eye on the sleep counter to ensure that when the boss gets its next action, the sleep debuff is still on, and therefore I will very comfortably get to skip their next turn. Okay, so sleep has worn off. Edward is of course out of lullaby, but the orb counter has reset to 20. So this is really the best time to swap Edward out. He's served his purpose to bring you this far, and this is where I'm about to pop my summon. So I bring Edward out for Kurosame first, and then I immediately use Kurosame's LD to inflict 5 stacks of his debuff, and this will allow me to deal 30% more damage. This is also the best time to refresh Kuja's LD because it gets a massive 30% HP damage increase. So inside summon is where you want to use up the remaining of all your powerful attacks, whoever you have in your party. I really still have 2 more of Lightning's LD, so this is where I space out the use so that I use LD followed by her free attacks, and then I can go to LD again. If Kuja is about spamming any remaining uses of his LD. As an extra buffer, if you have any character with burst mode, you can actually opt to use burst mode before going into the summon. This buys you additional 6 turns of damage in the burst mode, getting the burst effect after that from that character, and then going into summon mode to continue on the damage while keeping the orb paused. However, the main reason why I didn't use Kuja's burst here is really to test and demonstrate that you do not really need any burst to comfortably complete this fight. And that's it. Pretty straightforward fight, so long as you keep a very close eye on the Lufenia orb counter and you bring appropriate people to disable. As always, if you enjoy the video, do leave a like, leave a comment or subscribe. Till then, I'll see you in the next fight. Bye bye.